You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways, hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. On this episode, I wanted to invite Chef Sean Sherman for quite some time to Culture and Flavor. Last time I saw him, we were in Turin, Italy for the Slow Food Terra Madre conference. I was able to spend some time with him and his lovely partner, Mecca, and some of the chefs that he brought along on this journey at this beautiful Italian villa in Turin. He curated this beautiful dinner, and as I tasted this incredible meal using pre-colonial traditional ingredients of Turtle Island, I sat and I listened to Sean tell the story of Turtle Island. I gave tremendous thanks to the ancestors for being alive in that moment, a moment of remembrance, reclamation, and kinship. Native American cuisine is the most forgotten, invisible, and underrepresented cuisine on the same land that we are all on, where the buffalo once roamed in abundance, where bison were plentiful, and where food was not only sustenance, it was medicine. It was valued, it was sacred. So I was fangirling recently, like many of you all, when we all watched the episode of Finding Your Roots with Dr. Henry Louis Gates. And Sean found out so much about his family, and we'll talk about that in this episode. But I also, something that I realized about Sean and just spending time with him in Italy is he deeply is passionate about uh, reviving, reclaiming, and sharing this food, indigenous food, with not only the community, but also with young people and young chefs, in particular, young Native chefs. And so I'm excited for us to talk about the future, indigenous futurism in this episode. So welcome, Chef Sean Sherman.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start, because I know this is on a lot of people's minds. So as you found out the information about your family on Finding Your Roots, what were some of the things? Were you surprised by some of the findings? Did you have like an epiphany moment afterwards, and just after you process all the information that Dr. Gates presented to you?
I just thought it was a really fun day because, during the recording, we went through a lot of different family members. And in the show, they only kind of focus on a couple of them. So I think there was 3 in my family, that they brought the stories forward with. So it was just a long day, but it was really interesting. It was a lot of fun, and I deal with a lot of American history with my work. And Dr. Gates obviously is an amazing historian too. So I felt like we just had a lot of great conversations throughout that day about what was happening in America, and especially coming from these indigenous and Black lenses in America during these kind of crazy times.
Mm-hmm. And your family truly is an example of the American story. I mean, finding out about your great grandfather, who was African American too, was
Mm-hmm.
was like, whoa! Everybody was like, whoa!
Yeah,
That was
Buffalo
beautiful.
Soldier. Yeah.
Buffalo Soldier. Yes, yes, yes. And so, rural America and Indian country is very rarely part of the conversation in American media and politics. And so I wanted to just kind of ground this conversation in talking about your grandparents and growing up on the Pine Ridge Reservation.
Okay. Yeah, let's do it. What do you want to know?
Um, just about growing up in, um, I think I read a lot in some of the articles just about what you used to forage, some of the wild game that you all had access to. I would just like to learn more about what it was like on Pine Ridge Reservation.
Well, Pine Ridge Reservation, which is kind of south central South Dakota, is the third largest reservation in the United States. And so it's pretty massive. And, when we were growing up there as kids, we lived pretty far out in the country. So we grew up on a ranch that my grandparents managed, and we just were outside a lot. And we didn't really have the option of TV. Like we had TVs, yes, but we had like 1.5 channels, so it wasn't really much of an option. And so we spent a lot of our times outdoors, and we were just kind of feral little kids growing up in the country. And, we went to a local school nearby, and we had a lot of family in the town of Pine Ridge. So we spent a lot of time over there too. And there's a lot of, native events going on. So different celebrations and powwows and gatherings that happen throughout the year. And, so we're just around all of our Lakota family growing up. But, normally we grew up, I feel like fairly normal in America for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I think things were a little bit loose in the 70s and early 80s, and I think they were loose on Pine Ridge Reservation, especially. I teased my parents just because their parenting skills were a little bit lackadaisical back then, because we were just had so much freedom, and very little oversight. So we were just out there, all running around a lot, and we're just always running around the trees and running around the grass plains and just kind of everywhere. And for me, like, there were pieces of Lakota food cultures that we still had, like harvesting timpsila, which is a prairie turnip which grows out there on the plains, harvesting wild choke cherries, which we would kind of find here and there around the reservation, some hunting, of course. And, so there's pieces, but largely, like we grew up in, reservations are segregated communities, so we grew up in a highly segregated, you know, community, and that's kind of the reality of it. And so like there wasn't a lot of food access growing up, because on the reservation there were no restaurants, and Pine Ridge is a dry reservation, so there was a lot of alcohol issues and people smuggling alcohol in, and things like that. And I grew up with a lot of commodity food program food, so there was just a lot of government subsidy foods in our cabinets and on our dinner tables. And we were lucky that my grandparents had the ranch, because we were able to have a lot of, meat product, beef product, and things like that. And we ate everything that came around. So, tongue and the intestines and all the offals and all the things, like those are normal pieces on our meals. But, largely our food systems were stripped from us, less than a century before. And that's kind of what the work that I do was really about, was trying to return kind of something that was taken from us and showcase a new path by kind of evolving it for the future generations.
I years ago when I was a teenager, my mom, she was always giving me books, and she gave me she always wanted me to know about Native American history and those who were really, on the forefront of the American Indian movement
Hmm.
back in the day. And I remember reading Lakota Woman by Mary Crow Dog when I was a teenager. And that book was so profound in my just memory of books that kind of formed my understanding of um, life as a Native woman in Lakota Nation, and I think she was in Pine Ridge, if I'm not mistaken. And and so I would love for you to talk about just your tribe in general.
So Lakota, we're a pretty large tribe, and we're the Ochote Sakowin. So we have, quite a few different groups of us kind of around the Dakotas, mainly a little bit into Canada also. But, back in the day, we have a lot of Dakota communities coming from Minnesota. And then there's some Nakota communities kind of dotted about. But Lakota, like you can find us largely in South Dakota. and that's kind of where the main pieces are. And we took over a pretty massive area of what is Central North America when we were kind of at the peak of what was happening, because Lakota became very strong, especially when they adopted horses into the culture, which happened, even before they came across European peoples. They adopted horses, and it became a massive part of our culture because we became horse people, literally. And it enabled us to move a lot quicker. We could pick up camp and move, miles and miles within a single day. We were able to move a lot more food, hunt faster, and just be a little bit more fearsome, really, literally out there. And so, we just, again, we were stretched basically from the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming all the way out to the Missouri River and a little bit beyond, and up into what is North Dakota, Montana, and then all the way down into Colorado, Nebraska. And so there was just a massive area, and really centering around the Black Hills, which is for us as Lakota kind of our spiritual center. And so we obviously our food systems, we traded with a lot of other tribes. We hunted a lot. There was a lot of bison and elk and venison and rabbits and other things out there. And we just became a large and powerful tribe. And when we started, when the United States government starts to move out westward, we were amongst a lot of battles with them. And we were battling the United States government until basically the end of the 1800s. And we have warriors like Crazy Horse that were just constantly outmaneuvering a lot of the U.S. cavalry, just because as Lakota, they just knew the land so much better. And they were expert at riding horse and doing warfare on horses too. And even with not having the same kind of artillery, they were still able to, be really strategists about how they were able to continuously kind of outweigh the cavalry when it comes to some of those battles, leading up to the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where my great grandfather was about 18 years old during that battle on the Lakota side.
There were once 30 to 60 million bison roaming the Great Plains, and this was a source of food and ceremony and something so sacred for Native people. But then it became a weapon of genocide for, those that the colonialists who were fast approaching and taking over the U.S. And so then fast forward, Natives, barely survived that time period. And then I think about just commodities, food commodities forced into reservation, these commodities, the processed cheese, the white and bleach enriched flour, the frozen ground beef. And it sounds really familiar when you really think about it, because now we see it at, supermarket chains. And now it's, on our social media, the oozy gooey cheese that people are drooling on. And a lot of the food culture that we have now, the toxic food culture right now, actually started with these commodities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there are just a lot of industrialized food products that were built to really kind of supply a lot of home products for people to utilize to be able to survive, because the United States government was indebted to a lot of the tribes because of the treaties that they wrote, because of the massive amounts of land that was taken from them. And, and food and supplies were something that was promised with these treaties. And, so the commodity food and FDPIR program of the USDA, really ramps up in the late 60s. So by the time I was born in the early 70s, commodity food programs were pretty normal across the board. So again, we just had a lot of these cabinets filled with government canned peas and government cocktail fruit mixes and government canned salmon and government canned beef and all these kinds of things. And of course, the government cheese and powdered milk and, really basic government dry cereals and rice and things like that. So it's just a lot of these pantry items largely. But the problem with a lot of this food base is just that, the canned vegetables were packed in a lot of high sodiums. The fruits were packed in a lot of corn syrups. And, they literally just give us a gallon of corn syrup as sweetener to use, which we used a lot of. And then, and it's just a really carb heavy diet. And there's not a lot of nutrition or vitamins in the mix of these situations. And it caused a lot of health epidemic because of that nutrition access. And, we see a really high rates of type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and things coming, from getting addicted to these foods and utilizing them. And it's not that the foods are necessarily bad, but when it's all you have and that's your main source of nutrition, it's just not a very nutritious meal set to be able to live a long, happy life. And so if we went back to more indigenous diets, we would really have a lot more access to these nutritions that could counteract a lot of the issues that come out of things like commodity food program foods. Because for me, growing up on Pine Ridge, like we had one grocery store to service an area the size of Connecticut, and there was very little fresh food in that mix at all. And so, utilizing what was there, and the commodity food program, and maybe subsidizing some foods with some gas station foods or whatever might be around. It's just like we didn't have restaurants on the reservation growing up, and so you'd have to leave the reservation and drive quite a few hours to get to a restaurant, and that was just the reality of where we were.
Mm-hmm. And as school children, what, growing up, a lot of us were taught the food pyramid and seeing it in our classrooms. I would love to learn more about the food pyramid, indigenous food pyramid that you created in your restaurant, that you would like to share with our audience on how we can indigenize our food pantry and indigenize our diet.
Yeah, so the philosophy that I created, because I grew up on the reservation. My mom moved us off reservation when I was like barely starting high school, and I started working in restaurants when I was 13 years old in the northern Black Hills in a little tiny town called Spearfish. And it was just a lot of touristy restaurants I worked at. So just a lot of basic American steakhouses and things like that, and tourist restaurants. And after I finished high school and college in South Dakota, I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I just continued to work in restaurants. And I moved my way up and became a young chef in Minneapolis, Minnesota, back around the year 2000, and had a really good career to start with as a young chef in the city, and had decent write-ups in the papers and worked for decent restaurants. And I got into different cuisines. So I worked Spanish foods and French foods and Japanese foods and things like that, farm to table, of course. And then it was a few years into that I realized the complete absence of native foods. So I started really kind of trying to understand what indigenous foods meant and what that meant to me, especially growing up on a reservation, and why weren't there native foods everywhere, which became a big question. And why did I grow up on the reservation not knowing much about it? So I did a lot of studying and just trying to understand, and eventually kind of come up with a philosophy of, in order to showcase modern indigenous foods, I had to cut away colonial ingredients to really highlight the ingredients that were here from North America. So the philosophy removed things like wheat flour, cane sugar, dairy products, beef, pork, chicken, for example, and started trying to, utilize the abundance of the wild foods and wild plants around us, because the Western diets typically ignored a lot of the botany around North America and the amazing plants that create a lot of flavor and nutrition, and they're very regional too and seasonal. And then utilizing a lot more game meats, utilizing even insects for protein and a lot of different kinds of fish, and just being really open, and also searching for indigenous seeds, like who is still growing indigenous seed varietals of the corns and beans and squash and sunflowers and chilies and things like that, and trying to utilize and finding access to those pieces and figuring out, how do we play with all of these foods? How do we work with all these foods, and understanding how my ancestors were processing things, or food preservation methods or cooking techniques and all that stuff. But also, like, how can we further this and evolve this cuisine for a new generation? Because I wasn't trying to cook like it's 1491. I was trying to, understand as much as I could from the past so we can move forward, and keep a lot of health as the base of everything that we do.
Hmm. And you traveled a lot throughout Turtle Island, and you went to Mexico, and you visited many indigenous tribes, and just uh, sampled and tried and talked to some of the elders there. I would love to know about some of the lessons that you learned just on your path to reclaiming your own roots and being an advocate for other Native chefs to also reclaim their own food culture.
I just, I think it's really about diversity. So having that ability to start to move around and visit with other people from other tribes and learn some of their customs and ways, and, learning the differences that we have, but also the immense amount of commonalities that we have as Indigenous peoples, and seeing beyond just Native American people of the United States, but looking at all of North America, Mexico through Alaska, and then looking beyond, because everywhere colonialism has affected Indigenous peoples on a global scale. So whether you're in North America, Central America, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And colonialism has just happened everywhere. So I just see that commonality of how the values that Indigenous peoples had carried of living really close to the land, having countless generations of knowledge of how to identify plants, what to do with them, how to create food and medicine and craft with them, how to be resourceful and dehydrate and use very elemental cooking techniques to break down and preserve a lot of proteins. And there's just so much amazing regionality and seasonality dotted across that, and just a lot of great lessons about resourcefulness and not being wasteful. And there's just so many cool flavors across the board, and finding instances of indigenous fermentation techniques and other kinds of food preservation methods. And I just think that it's a massive global world that we should be stewarding indigenous knowledge bases instead of trying to dismantle them and whitewash them. That's been going on for too long. And so for me, this was an opportunity to just showcase what was possible for indigenous foods in North America, but it really resonates on that global scale.
We recently had a guest on our show, a chef from Johannesburg. Well, she's from Western Cape town, the Western Cape in South Africa.
Oh, nice. I was just there.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's so amazing. Oh, my
Yeah.
God. We had a 3-part series. So by the time your episode will come out, you can listen to it later. But I remember her having a conversation with a couple of chefs out there, and they were just talking about how corn, is an invasive species to Africa because it sucks up and the version of corn that was given to them. And she had made this beautiful comment just about how, the corn wants to return to its home,
Mm-hmm.
And I would love for you just to kind of talk about the various varieties of corn, because the version that we have, is yellow, genetically modified, and it's
Mm-hmm.
spread all over the world. And it is a huge engine for, corporate big farm agricultural companies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I'm working really closely with indigenous seed keepers all over North America, from Mexico, even, further on. But, historically, corn culture was so massive, and it covered such a massive area because it covers um, almost all of Mexico, basically the entire Caribbean, and it also encompasses the entire southeast, all the way up the East Coast, and past parts of the United States, and then all the way up to Mississippi, Missouri River Valley, and basically everywhere in between there. And there's just so much area that so many different native communities adopted corn into their cultures. And because of that, we have so much amazing varieties of corns and beans and squash and sunflowers and chilies and things like that, that are so normalized everywhere else around the world. But, we typically see the large GMO corns that are out there. And, but for native communities like at Owamni, we bring in about, I think we have 7 different native nations that we purchase corn from, and some of them have multiple varieties. So we have blue corns and purple corns and yellow corns and white corns and spotted corns and striped corns and all sorts of different kinds of cool colors of things, coming from very specific nations Potawatomi or Mandan or Arikara, Hidatsa, and so forth. There's just Ponca. And so there's so many different communities all over the place that we're growing all these varieties. And then you can just trace that down into Mexico, all the way down into Oaxaca and Yucatan. And you just see all of this wonderful and beautiful corn culture that still lives. And around, there's still a ton of heirloom varieties that still live today, even despite a lot of the violence towards indigenous peoples and cultures and the overtaking of land spaces and farming communities. And so I feel really lucky that we were able to find so many still living varieties of corn that we could still utilize and enjoy in today's world.
Y'all, when we come back for the second half, we are going to talk about kinship and Prince, because I think Chef Sean Sherman loves Prince and his partner Mecca. So we're going to talk about that because I'm a huge Prince fan. So we will be back after a few messages. Thank you for joining Culture and Flavor.
This episode is brought to you by Plugra European-style butter, crafted for those who demand precision and exceptional results in the kitchen. With 82% butter fat and a slow churn process, Plugra gives you flakier crusts, fluffier cakes, and rich, melt-in-your-mouth pastries. Because great baking starts with great butter. Unlike standard American butters, which have only 80% butter fat, Plugra ensures the ideal moisture and fat balance so your recipes turn out just right every time. That's why professional chefs trust Plugra and home bakers love it. Plugra's slow churn process creates a smooth, creamy butter that gives dough a soft, pliable texture, making rolling, folding, and laminating effortless. Whether you're perfecting a buttery pie crust or layering a delicate croissant, Plugra helps you bake with confidence. Experience the difference for yourself. Find Plugra in stores near you or visit plugra.com. That's Plugra.com.
So we're back. I would love to know just how you see Indigenous futurism.
Yeah, I think it's got a really amazing and bright future because I think that we're able to look past what colonization has brought, which was kind of a lot of appropriation of our cultures across the board, especially when you think of touristy places, like if you're in downtown Honolulu or in the Grand Canyon or some of these places where you might find something about the indigenous cultures around that area, but they're very, generic and have nothing really to do with the actual cultures that are right there and the peoples who are living close by. And I think that because indigenous peoples, we went through, all of us had gone through such intense histories and surviving really awful pieces of history, including genocide in many different forms all over the place. And that we've come to a point where we're starting to see the value and of our cultures and standing up for our cultures and voicing our cultures. And we're coming from a generation that's being highly educated, because there's a lot of education involved, and we're seeing amazing role models in all facets of things, whether they're restaurateurs like ourselves, or they're authors, or they're artists, or they're actors in TV and movies. I just believe that, or even politicians, and people working in some of those spheres, that we've had amazing indigenous voices and leaders being really visible for the first time in forever. And I think it's really important that's to understand that that's resonating in a lot of the younger indigenous communities and populations out there. And that, I think we're going to continue to so many of us doing this work will continue to be role models, because we can see how this will resonate, because the next generations can take this further. And that's really how I see my work, is just trying to basically kick open doors that have been locked for us for too long and showcase a path of what we can do and set things up so the next generations have better access, better education, better understanding of their ways, and being able to do something and find work and find a life and a passion amongst those areas to take it even further, so we can start to normalize seeing Native everywhere, whether it's in TV and movies or arts or touristy spaces or restaurants and wherever it might be. We have room to be everywhere, and I think that with what we've created in Minnesota, especially with the restaurant Owamni, of how it really resonated, that it's a really good indication that there's a lot of interest for true indigenous cultures to stand up to talk about, because we're not concepts of the past, but we're products of right now, and we're constantly looking forward to the future. And I think that's the biggest piece to it all.
So, chef culture and you worked in a lot of restaurants, tourist spots, different restaurants, and chef culture has historically been very toxic, very a place that doesn't necessarily support the idea or the concept of kinship. I would love to just understand how you set up your kitchen. What does your kitchen look like when you work with different chefs from different parts of the country, different parts of other Native communities across the globe, and how you set up your dinner series?
Yeah, well, I mean, our team is really open to working with other Native chefs, and they just have a kind of an open door policy. So we've allowed a lot of Native chefs to come in and welcome them into our kitchen in Minneapolis, and to just, create a place where they can feel welcome and comfortable, and being able to, have them kind of run through the challenge that we utilize on a daily basis of just following our philosophy of, trying to cook without colonial ingredients and really highlighting and features our culture featuring our cultures through our food and through these plates that we create. And it's fun to do those tasting menus because, each plate can have so much intention and so much story to tell about why we're choosing this protein, or what this sauce means significantly, or what these herbs or berries or components might mean to. And I think that that's a really fun part about, the high end kind of fine dining side of things. But, the restaurant itself is really just family style. Like when it's just in normal form, like we just have a wonderful menu where people just order and share with their table because we want everybody to experience things. And that family style is a real, indigenous cultural piece of just like being there and sharing everything in front of everybody. And so it's been a lot of fun to put that together and to invite people to talk about, the different cultures, because we just had my friend Joseph Schwana from one of the tribes up in Canada featuring some of his products and his skills and his stories. And then we had my chef friend, Justin Payoche from Navajo Nation with us not too long ago. And we've got a chef from Alaska coming in this week. And we just, been able to really have fun with those kinds of tasting series of keeping an open platform for more and more Native chefs to come to work and play with our kitchen staff and to come up with a whole bunch of amazing creations that the public can come and enjoy.
So I remember when we were in Italy and you curated this amazing dinner. I will never forget that. My student was also able to attend, and she was so excited, and she took pictures and sent them to you guys. And you gave a beautiful talk and just reverence to what really is Thanksgiving and what it should be.
Yeah, I mean, that was our challenge of we wanted to make food taste like a place and a culture, so like we're in the Great Lakes region around Minnesota, where there's lots of forests and lots of lakes, of course, and we wanted to make food taste like here. So it's normal to find ingredients like balsam fir, white cedar, high bush cranberries, hyssop, bergamot, blueberries, wintergreen, duck, venison, rabbits, beavers, lake fish like trout and whitefish, northerns, things like that, bison, of course, and plus just a lot of the amazing agricultural products and utilizing some of the heirloom corns from this region and beans and squash and sunflowers and stuff, and just making food taste like a place, and wild rice and maple. And a lot of these ingredients, you can just stand in one spot and look around and just see all those pieces all around us. And so I think that's just a lot of fun. It's a fun challenge. And, we also make recipes that represent other areas. So some recipes might be very Northeastern or Southeastern or Pacific Northwestern or Southern Alaskan or Great Plains or Southwest, and so we just see, we look at North America as a whole, which is where our main culinary focus is, and just really try to create food utilizing the products that came from Indigenous communities that have been celebrated by Indigenous communities for countless generations. And I just think that there's so much to explore, and because we're looking at North America as a whole, like it doesn't matter about these colonial borders that get drawn of, which country's which between Mexico and US, Canada, or who's speaking Spanish, English, or French, because those are all foreign languages on this land space. And so we just want to highlight and showcase the massive amount of diversity that's out there. And we just finished a project where my next cookbook comes out in November, and
Oh,
it
wow.
highlights all of that. So it looks at Mexico through Alaska, and it breaks North America up into all these different regions to showcase all the vast diversity that's out there through a cookbook lens, and just exploring like how we can be challenging ourselves to look at the regionality of North America, not just trying to homogenize everything or pretend
Mhm.
Indigenous peoples didn't exist. That there's so much to explore out there.
Mm. I can't wait to read it. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, it's gonna
And
be a good one. It's called Turtle
yeah, I can't
Island.
wait. Oh my goodness. You heard it here on Culture of Flavor. um, I would love for you just to kind of talk about the power of fasting and or the power of the relationship that indigenous and native people pre-colonial times had with their food, and how these traditions are sacred to your community, but also bringing it into kind of the intersectionality between Black and Indigenous communities. Because I know you've been doing a lot of research lately, you and Mecca, just
Mhm.
grappling with those ideas about Black and Indigenous histories, mutual histories.
Well, there's just so much that binds us together, not only in just American history, but also looking at just where we all come from. Because the history of the United States, it's built from stolen land spaces from the indigenous communities over in North America, and a lot of it's largely built with forced labor from stolen indigenous peoples from Africa. And because of our indigenous communities being forced together, like so many of us had agricultural experiences that really helped ramp up what is the American agricultural scene today and the industrialization of that eventually. And of course, like our products have been normalized across the board, and you can easily tie the history of American foods to Black and Indigenous peoples rather quickly when you go down that path. And there's so many contributions that come from both sides of that. And for me, I just see so much commonality in that, and not only with the foods that we created that become American foods, but just also the immense diversities and the knowledge bases that we had, that our ancestors had, but also a lot of the violence, the assimilation, the racism, the segregation, and the breakdown of a lot of our cultures. And it's really difficult to understand our own personal histories in America because of how broken a lot of our family lines have been because of American colonization. And so I just think that food really pulls things together, because food is doesn't really sit in a particular time. Like food can move across times, and I feel like food is also a cultural identifier. So as we start to really identify and reclaim how our ancestors, the foods that they were eating, and move it forward. Like, again, we don't have to recreate everything from the past. Like, we can just take the notions and the education and the knowledge from our ancestors and apply them to be able to move them forward into the next generations, because it's important that we all evolve and continuously evolve and adapt things, and we can still hold on to our cultures, and we can rebuild cultures where they've been decimated because of that. And so I think it's been a lot of fun as we have explored those intersections of Black and Indigenous and American foodways, of utilizing a lot of these Indigenous influences from North America, and a lot of Indigenous influences, especially with people from West Africa and so forth, that contributed so much of their own into what we know. And I just think it's just a wonderful, fun thing to play with.
I see. I just need to sit down with some wine with you and Mecca, and
Yeah,
and we can talk about our Prince stories, because I know you have a Prince story. You're in
absolutely.
Minneapolis. Okay, please share a Prince story with our listeners.
Well, when I moved to Minneapolis, I didn't really know anything about Minneapolis except for Prince, and some of the musicians that were in town here. And I think the first sighting I had of Prince, it was just at a nightclub that happened to be his nightclub, but I didn't know. I was just in my young 20s, and I was just hanging out back. And then this big entourage of like limos and things pull up, and then there's Prince, and he walks right by me, and he's like up to my shoulders barely, because I'm taller. So, but I think a lot of people are taller probably. But and it was just really interesting, because he's such an amazing. His story is so amazing, and like his skill, there's no comparison out there of just like how much he brought to the music world, and just what an artist he was. Literally, he can just pick up any instrument and just be fully versed in it. And I just think that people don't always realize just like that genius of that was just living in him, and obviously he created so much music that touched so many people. And in Minnesota, like everybody's got a Prince story, of course, because everybody, it's not a big city, and like everybody touches a Prince situation somewhere or another. And Mecca's a lifelong Prince fan. And I think Purple Rain was her first concert growing up, and and she's just she's seen him multiple times, and been to Paisley Park at the parties and all the things. And so I just think that we feel lucky, because Prince never left Minneapolis. He just made this his home, and we just feel, I think, as a community here in Minneapolis, we've always felt very proud that this was the home of Prince.
Mm. See, I could listen to Prince all day, and I need to
Oh
like a
yeah,
jam session with Mecca, so we could just just put on all the vinyls and just let's go. And I'll bring my vanity
absolutely.
outfit. But this was such a great conversation. I'm so excited to please, I would love to see your the first copy of Turtle Island. I can't wait to invite you back. And Thank you for all the work that you do, Sean. And it's such a pleasure to know you. And please keep up the good work and give my love to Mecca. And thank you for joining Culture and Flavor.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And just excited to see when we connect paths again.
I know. Maybe it'll be in Cape Town. You never know where it's going to Italy. We don't know, but we thank the ancestors. We thank the ancestors for bringing us all together.
Thank you so much.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Yeah. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.